Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the LSU Sports Insider Podcast. I'm Zach Ewing, joined today by Scott Rabelais and Reed Dorsey on this rainy Thursday afternoon here in Baton Rouge. Reed, you said your power already went out once today, so if we lose Reed, that's probably what happened. Or if any of us got cut out, that's what happened.
All it took was a big gust of wind, and then it went out, but it's back, so we should be good.
Yeah, we are actually recording this, and I'm going to post it later this afternoon. So you might look outside and be like, "It's not raining. What are you talking about?" But this is being recorded around 2:00. So, obviously, talked with Wilson and Rab on what day was that? Rab, Monday, that we talked about media days last week and
yes,
takeaways from LSU and from the SEC as a whole. And we will be back next Monday to preview LSU's training camp. But in the meantime, we thought we'd do kind of a more fun episode. I'm excited for this one. We're going to discuss LSU football's Mount Rushmore and who should be on it. As we all know, Mount Rushmore has 4 faces on it. It gets tight real quick when you're talking about a school with 3 Heisman Trophy winners. So I think this is going to be an interesting discussion. I guess we'll start right there, guys. First of all, is there any question in your mind that all 3 Heisman winners, Billy Cannon, Joe Burrow, Jayden Daniels, all occupy 3 of the 4 spots on this Mount Rushmore?
it seems like a no-brainer, obviously, and I think a lot of younger people, if I may say, would gravitate towards maybe someone else from the last 20, 25 years of this century. But I think you have to include Billy Cannon on there for sure. And if we want to talk about each one, we can talk about each one. But yeah, I mean, 3 Heisman winners. It's hard to beat that. Yeah, but until a few years ago, it was a much more wide open thing. I remember I did the LSU by the numbers in the paper back in 2006, and number 9 was not Joe Burrow. Obviously, it was a guy who was a good player. I think it was Devery Henderson or somebody like that. So very good player, but he wasn't a Heisman Trophy winner. And so these things are kind of, when you have 3 like that, it kind of makes it a fait accompli that you pick those people. But I think you have to go with Billy Cannon, Joe Burrow, and Jayden Daniels. I mean, why not? They all had tremendous accomplishments in their careers. 2 of them won national championships. Jayden did not have a chance to do that, but he certainly had a championship caliber offense that he led. So I think, those are obvious ones. If LSU ever has more than 3, it's going to get a little difficult. But I think for now, you have to include them.
Yeah, I mean, this discussion, and we'll get into who just missed our Mount Rushmore later, and maybe it's the same answer. But this discussion would have been a whole lot different, Reed, 6 years ago. If we're talking summer of 2019, before Joe Burrow has his big season, obviously before Jayden Daniels came to LSU, that discussion's changed. If we could talk about all 3 of these, how would you rank them? Who is absolutely your number 1 choice to be on Mount Rushmore above all the others?
Joe Burrow. He was the one that I thought of first, just because 2019 was so special. We're going to look back at that 2019 season, that 2019 offense, and we're just going to hold it, a cut above the rest. I think just what that team accomplished, how it accomplished, what it accomplished, going 15-0 in the modern era of college football is incredibly impressive. And then when you think about all the talent on that team between Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, that offensive line, Derek Stingley, Grant Delpit, you can go on and on and on about that team. Burrow was the face of it, right? And that team was really the perfect combination of everything that could have possibly gone right with LSU football. When everything is rowing in the right direction, everything's clicking, that's what this program can look like, right? It has a higher ceiling than just about any program in the country. So I think it's obvious that Burrow's number 1 for the 15-0 season, the Heisman, and the national championship as the icing on the cake. And then I think the other 2, I agree with Rab. I think the other 2 are locks pretty much in. It doesn't make for a great podcast, but those 3 right there are shoo-ins for me.
So Rab, first of all, do you agree that Joe is probably number 1 on this list, given what he accomplished in just 2 years here?
There's a great argument to be made for Joe Burrow. He was that season doesn't happen without him. He was the catalyst. He He believed in LSU enough to come here when really they were just selling him on a vision. Ed Orgeron was selling him on a vision when he transferred from Ohio State. And not only as Reed said, an extremely talented team with lots of pieces other than Joe Burrow, but he was the straw that spilled the drink. Obviously, he's the quarterback, so he's facilitating the offense. He was also the leader. You go back to the New Year's Day of 2019 and the Fiesta Bowl against UCF. He throws that interception, and he just gets blindsided, by a hit that was not called a penalty. It was just a hard hit on a guy trying to block for a very hard hit, a guy blocking for a teammate who's running back a pick six. Then Joe comes back and throws a touchdown pass, and one of the LSU players, I think it was Jamar Chase, said Burrow is tough as hell after that game. And I think that cemented his leadership. They needed someone to rally around and say, hey guys, let's go win a championship. And they believed in Joe, and he was absolutely tremendous. He was everything they needed. All that said, I think Billy Cannon is still the number one, and here's why. Billy Cannon is still, in the minds of a lot of people, the standard by which all other players are judged at LSU. Is like, he's great. So-and-so is great. This guy's great. This guy's great. Is he as good as Billy Cannon? Billy Cannon was a star on offense. He had to play defense. Back then, you had to play both ways. But in 1958, all his whole career, you could only come in the game at the start of a quarter and once thereafter in the quarter. So he was on what they called the white team, which was LSU's best 11 players. Warren Rabbit, quarterback, Johnny Robinson, who's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, guys like that. And so they had to play offense and defense. Billy Cannon and Warren Rabb stopped the Ole Miss quarterback on the goal line in 1959 in that famous game where no one remembers Billy Cannon's punt return on Halloween night. Billy Cannon punted the ball. Billy Cannon was the SEC track champion in 1958. He won the 100-yard dash. He also threw the shot put. He was an unusually gifted athlete for his league. In my mind, one of only a couple of players, along with I think he and Johnny Robinson, who could still start today for an LSU team, because there were only three guys who weighed over 200 pounds, and Billy was one of them on that team. He was a tremendous athlete, and he was a tremendous talent, and he did it in all those phases. And I think, he created the mythic status of LSU football that everyone else is still benefiting from today. I think it's Billy Cannon.
Yeah, and I guess the way I come down on this, because I could see it's a little bit old school versus new school. Like, who do you say is number one on this list? And I think there's an argument to be made for both of them. I do think Jayden Daniels is probably third, and that's not a slight to him. It's just that he followed Burrow so quickly. He also was the only one of the three who didn't win a national championship. So I think he's third, but I also think there's no question he belongs. Do you agree with that, Reed?
Yeah, there's no question he belongs. I mean, he's on my list, 100%. I think people of my generation, look at him and have probably have a tendency to dismiss, him just because it happened in 1958, 1959, the late 50s, but everything that he did and everything that those teams accomplished back then set the standard and built, like Rab said, built the mystique of LSU football and Tiger Stadium. Without the Halloween run against Ole Miss, it's like a huge part of the mythology goes away without that. So I think he's incredibly important, essential, and on top of that, he's from Baton Rouge, so he's a local homegrown product who became a star on the national scene. Not just locally. So, yeah, Billy Cannon, you have to have him on your list. And we can debate whether he's one or two, I think.
Jayden Daniels was, there was nobody like him. Joe Burrow ran the ball some. Somebody like Herb Tyler was a running, throwing quarterback. But I'll never forget the game. He gets knocked out of the Alabama game. He's concussed on what was a cheap hit in that game. Comes back against Florida the next week. I forget the sequence, but he throws like a deep sideline pass that's just right on the money, right over the defensive back, and he runs for 40 yards on the next play, or vice versa. And I turned to Wilson Alexander and said, "There's no one in the country that can do that. There's no one in LSU history who could quite do that. And what I admire about Jayden so much is he came here without a lot of fanfare. Neither did Burrow, to a certain extent, but he didn't come without a lot of fanfare. You're like, LSU is putting a lot of stock in this guy. Remember we were saying going into the 2022 season, who's going to be the quarterback? And if people ask me, I'd say, well, I'm going to default to Miles Brennan because he's the veteran. He's the guy who's been here. And then Jayden just takes over. And then he starts 2022, has a good season, not a great season, but they do beat Alabama in that thrilling overtime game, which is, to me, the best game I've ever seen in Tiger Stadium. And then he comes back and really works to make himself not just a great runner and a great thrower. And it's been continued with his rookie season in the NFL, which was just tremendous. For him to go into the NFL and do what he did in his first year was just amazing. So I give Jayden Daniels a lot of credit for developing himself and making himself into a great player. And it's not his fault that the defense was so bad. I mean, the offense in 23 was every bit as good as the offense in 2019. And the defense couldn't stop anybody. Not that the 2019 defense was an all-time great defense at LSU, but Jayden couldn't play defense like Billy Cannon did. He couldn't help the cause that way. So, somebody's got to be third on the list. I go Cannon, Burrow, Daniels, but it's what a list to be third on. To have the bronze medal on that list is not too bad.
I think you said Billy Cannon was one of only two players over 200 pounds. Jayden Daniels is like one of only two players under 200 pounds. I mean, I'm joking, but it's funny the way I do think you look at this from a historical perspective. LSU football obviously has a tremendous history going back to the 50s and even before that. The fact that two of your four Mount Rushmore, and we're going to talk about our last choice here soon, were from the last 6 years. At first it seems kind of like, well, that can't be right. That's recency bias. But I struggled to find an argument. I mean, you have to include Joe Burrow, and I think you have to include Jayden Daniels. Like, yes, they're more modern, but as we expand this discussion, like one thing is LSU's had some great teams. It's hard to pinpoint individual players who you say that guy definitely belongs on Mount Rushmore until you get to Burrow and Daniels.
Yeah, I think, the only thing working against Jayden here is the success of the team. That season by and large was a pretty forgettable run, in terms of how it happened and where it ended, his Heisman season, and he really defined that season. The thing about it is that I don't really want to penalize him for how bad the defense was. Right. That's not his fault. He has no control over that. And that team, had he not had such a great season, maybe that team would have been in even deeper holes, to climb out of. So I think Jayden absolutely on the list. One thing that gave me pause was the fact that, there have been so many great teams at LSU, championship teams, national championship contending teams, that, Jayden's team, his Heisman team, didn't really get too close to that. But through no fault of his own, so I didn't feel like that would be fair to hold that against him.
Yeah, I think we all agree with that. So we are in lockstep on the three Heisman winners: Billy Cannon, Joe Burrow, Jayden Daniels have to be on the LSU football Mount Rushmore. You are listening to the LSU Sports Insider podcast. Let us know in the comments below if you think those three are locks. If you would leave one of them off, who would it be? You better come prepared with a good argument because people are going to get after you, I think. But hey, it's a free country. You can have your say. And also, while you're at it, hit the like button and subscribe to the LSU Sports Insider on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. The fourth choice, gentlemen. This is where the two of you differed. And Rab, you took an interesting tack, and I'm going to go with your number 4 first and foremost. And speaking of angry comments, you might get a couple, but I think this is a logical choice as well. It's Nick Saban. You went with a coach. And I think the way you described it when we were texting back and forth about this is that he was the one who sort of pioneered the modern era of LSU football. And LSU football, honestly, without the modern era, I don't think it's looked upon nearly as highly in national circles as it is now. So you could argue that he was one of the 4 most important in school history and program history.
Yeah, no question. And look, there's a lot of players you could go with. I'm thinking of Tommy Casanova, who played in the late 60s and early 70s, was probably the last great three-way player for LSU. He was a great defensive back, returned punts, ran at running back a little bit. Was LSU's only 3-time All-American. Glenn Dorsey, who played on the 2007 team, the most decorated defensive player in LSU history. Tyrann Mathieu, who just retired, the most disruptive defensive player I've ever seen at LSU. And then some offensive players like Leonard Fournette or Kevin Faulk, or players like that. But I think coaches are. You can't just talk about players when you talk about the history of a program or how it shapes up or how it measures up to other people. You have to talk about coaches as well, because they're more of the constant than the players. The players come and go so frequently in college sports, and the coaches are more of the constant. And I have to go. I said Nick Saban because he ushered in the current era of LSU football, which before Saban, the golden era of LSU football was from the late 60s to the early 70s, the late 50s to the early 60s, excuse me, the Paul Dietzel era. Maybe you can go to the early 70s. But that was Billy Cannon. And then after Cannon left, they won the SEC title in 61 again. And then, they had some other good teams through the early 70s. But then the program kind of fell off, and LSU was kind of like a 7-4, 8-4 kind of program for a lot of years. Wasn't really on the national radar for a long, long time. When I was in high school, they made it to the Orange Bowl, and they won 8 games, and they made it to the Orange Bowl in 1982 and lost to Nebraska, a great Nebraska team by 1 point. Like, oh my gosh, LSU's in a New Year's Day bowl game again for the first time in 9 years. And it was a drought. They would lose to Alabama every year, that sort of thing. Saban came and changed the culture, changed the expectation. He said, he came in saying, I need this and this and this. I need a football complex. I need an academic facility. I need a better training table, better weight room, and all those things eventually got built. And LSU is still seeing the benefits of this. So now the golden era of LSU is really since in the 2000s. I mean, 3 of the 4 national championships, SEC titles in 01, 03, 07, 19, 4 SEC titles. 2 of the 3 Heisman Trophy winners, and it all starts with Saban and the expectation that he created, and the demand for excellence that he created. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy on people. He was difficult to deal with, but he created this culture that still persists at LSU today. When Brian Kelly stands up in the Rotary Club at Rotary Club luncheon, as we saw on Wednesday, and talks about the LSU standard. It existed before Saban with Billy Cannon and the Chinese Bandits and Paul Dietzel and those guys, but it really was polished to a high shine by Nick Saban. And I know he's not a popular figure because he came back at Alabama and beat LSU a lot of times, but LSU owes Nick Saban a great debt of gratitude for what he created and what continues to persist at LSU football today.
Yeah, like I think the only argument against him maybe is he wasn't here all that long.
5 years, that's true.
But I always thought pro sports you identify players with franchises. In college sports you identify coaches with programs, with football and basketball and baseball. And I don't know what other coach. I mean, Les Miles, I guess, would be the guy, unless you're going to go in the way back machine. When college football was really in a different time. I think Saban is a fine choice if you want to, if you want to include a coach. I'm curious though, Reed, as sort of a younger LSU alum and someone who's followed this program really all in the post Saban era, what is your take on including Nick Saban on LSU's Mount Rushmore?
It's tough. I keep going back and forth. It's hard to argue with Rab. It's hard to say that there's any reason why you shouldn't put him on there, because he is responsible for bringing the program into the modern era, and he's the one that lit the spark, right? But at the same time, I have trouble putting him on the LSU Mount Rushmore, because when I think Nick Saban, I think Alabama, and I think Alabama has, just owns Nick Saban. Nick Saban owns Alabama in a way that, it just feels weird to put him on LSU's Mount Rushmore. I think he wasn't quite here long enough. He won the national title, but He left after 5 years. If he wants to be on the LSU Mount Rushmore, if he wants to be one of the four faces of LSU football and its program's history, then he should have stayed longer. He shouldn't have left for the Miami Dolphins, and he shouldn't have taken the job at Alabama and then been LSU's top rival for 15, close to 20 years. So I think Alabama has ownership over Nick Saban, not LSU, and I think that that's why when we're splitting hairs here in terms of determining who's that fourth spot, why I went with a more modern player instead of Nick Saban as a coach.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit it on the head there. Can he be on LSU's Mount Rushmore if he's known for it's like what cap the guys wear in the Baseball Hall of Fame when they go in this weekend. Like if he's not going to be wearing an LSU cap on his Hall of Fame plaque, can he be on LSU's Mount Rushmore? I don't know. So that's a hard question. I think ultimately that's why a lot of LSU fans would leave him off. But I don't think it's wrong to consider him either. So, Reed, what was your choice?
Tyrann Mathieu. I absolutely went with him. He I think some of my earliest, most vivid memories of watching LSU football. It was Tyrann Mathieu. I remember the forced fumble against Oregon at Jerry World, I think 2011. Vivid memories of that. I have vivid memories of him returning the punt return for a touchdown in the SEC championship game. It's those kinds of plays, the splash plays, the turnovers, the touchdowns as a defensive player that really stick out to me, and just the impact that he had, the force that he had. Everybody who's around my age, grew up watching him and watching his highlights, and it just sticks with people today. He is an incredibly huge part of the DBU brand that LSU cherishes so much to this day. Without him, it loses a lot of its mystique. And on top of that, he's from Louisiana. He's a New Orleans guy, and he did a lot of good for his home state. So in terms of just sheer production, talent, force, and the Honey Badger nickname as well, that adds to it as well. I just think that he was a cut above the rest in terms of his impact and influence for players who came after him at LSU. So I split some hairs there. It was tough to choose between him and a few others, but he goes on there just because of his overall impact.
Rab, how far down your list would Mathieu have been? Was he close?
Yeah, it's close. I think I'd put him probably behind Glenn Dorsey and Tommy Casanova, to name two, if I name two other players. But boy, Reed's right. I mean, he was as dynamic. I don't know if he was the greatest defensive back in LSU history, but he was certainly the most dynamic. I think Patrick Peterson might have been a greater defensive back, for example. But he certainly held up the DBU, carried the mantle of DBU for LSU very well, and just seemed like it was almost watching him play was almost on another level. Like, is he really making all these plays? Is he really on the spot every time? There was a call. Not only to strip the ball from somebody, he stripped it, then score. He stripped Kenyon Barner on that punt that Reed's talking about it in the Oregon game, and then scored the touchdown. That was LSU's first touchdown of the game. They're down 10-0 to Georgia in the 2011 SEC championship game. He scores on a punt return, and it was really his second best punt return of the game. He had another one later in the game where he didn't score that was even more amazing. He only played 2 years. Of course, they kicked him off the team for violating substance abuse policy before the 2012 season. And so, who knows what he would have done.
Today, by the way. That would never have happened today, I don't believe.
That's true. That's probably true.
But rules are rules at the time. I mean, I just want to.
Right. But boy, what a dynamic player, and what a the sacks and the fumbles and the fumble recoveries and the interceptions and the punt returns and the big hits. And for someone not a I was talking about size of Billy Cannon earlier, not a big guy, 5'9", 170 or something like that. So then to go on and play, he just retired. Obviously, go on and play a dozen seasons in the NFL also speaks to his tremendous his greatness as a player. It's hard not to go with Tyrann Mathieu. I think I have to go with the coach, because you have to, as you said, that people identify with coaches so much in college football. Just imagine an Alabama Mount Rushmore. You'd have to put Saban and Bear Bryant on there. Then you find two other players. There aren't any players who would match up to them. But LSU, it's much different in terms of the players. But Tyrann's a great choice, and it's hard to make an argument against him. And it's just a personal preference, and not really a true argument.
I think one thing that can separate him when we're splitting these hairs is, like Rab, you mentioned how Billy Cannon and Casanova and some of those guys, they had to play, all three phases. They had to play offense and defense. Tyrann Mathieu is one of LSU's greatest defensive players, but he's also one of their greatest special teamers. And so I think that adds to his argument as well.
Yeah, I mean, Tyrann Mathieu, more than any other player, to me, personified that era of LSU football, sort of pre-Burrow, right? Like the era from, let's say, 2001 to 2018, LSU was known as a defensive school. Like, they were winning games. They weren't winning these games
in spite of their offense. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And more than any other player, and we could talk about Glenn Dorsey in a second, but more than any other player, I think Tyrann Mathieu, he personified that era. You had the Honey Badger video in the early days of YouTube. I'm not even sure it's not suitable for work. If you haven't seen it, make sure you're home and not in earshot of the kids. But I think that added to it too, where he was the Honey Badger, and he just had this coolness about him. I mean, I was not living in Louisiana at the time, and I still loved watching LSU play because of Tyrann Mathieu. Kellen Moore, the Saints coach, talking about Tyrann retiring in their press conference on Tuesday, and Kellen Moore never coached Tyrann Mathieu, but somebody asked him, like, hey, you coached against him. And I had forgotten this, but he goes, yeah, he picked us off with the Eagles last year in the game in the Dome, and it was a typical Honey Badger play where he just outsmarted us, and nobody thought he was going to be there, and all of a sudden he's just there, and he's got an interception. He's not the biggest guy, he's not the fastest guy, he's not the strongest guy, certainly not at his age. He still made 10 interceptions in 2 years for the Saints, well past his prime, because he just had this knack of just knowing where the ball was going to be.
And being around the ball. You talk about having a nose for the ball, that's what personified him, just in a similar way to, it's not a perfect example at all, but to what we saw at Harold Perkins his freshman year, he just had a way for being around the ball and for sniffing the ball out. It's just a natural thing you can't teach, and it's what he had, and it's a huge part of who he was as a player.
Okay, so we've mentioned some of these names, and again, leave in the comments below, assuming that you're taking the 3 Heisman winners on your LSU football Mount Rushmore, who is your 4th? Or if you're one of these people who doesn't think all 3 Heisman winners belong, then who's your 3rd and 4th or whatever? There's a lot of choices here, and I almost want to, Rab, I don't know if you've done this exercise in your career before, but if we go back 8 years or 10 years, it's hard to pinpoint players over. There's a lot of great players, but it's hard to find the 1 or 2 that transcend above everybody else. You mentioned a lot of the names, Tommy Casanova, Hall of Famer, Y.A. Tittle, great early quarterback in the early days of college football. Alan Faneca, Hall of Famer, Jim Taylor, Kevin Mawai, Johnny Robinson, Steve Van Buren. Those are your Pro Football Hall of Famers. We talked about Glenn Dorsey, who was, maybe the best player on LSU's 2007 national championship team. Kevin Faulk, who's kind of a local legend and did really well at LSU and came back and coached later. I mean, there's a lot of choices. I don't know that there's an obvious one. Like Jayden Daniels, to me, really kind of helped you do this exercise easier, but where do you fall down on some of these other players? Who would have been next in line? Or if we'd said 8 years ago, who are you putting up?
Yeah, I mean, Tommy Casanova is one I keep coming back to, because, like I said, a 3-time All-American, and was just a tremendous player. Played pretty well in the NFL. I'll tell you another name, going way back, is Jerry Stovall, who followed in Billy Cannon's footsteps. Played in the early '60s. Was the Heisman runner-up in 1962. A lot of people say, if it weren't for the fact that, let's call it LSU fatigue, that Cannon had just won the Heisman in '59, that Jerry Stovall would have beaten out Terry Baker, the Oregon State quarterback, to win the '62 Heisman Trophy. He was a player very much in the Cannon mold. Was a runner and played defense and played special teams. He went on to a better pro football career probably than you could say Billy Cannon. And if he'd come along a few years later, he might have won the Heisman based on what he did. And so we'd be talking about a fourth Heisman Trophy winner. I mean, he's like the one who's like one notch below. Tyrann Mathieu was a Heisman finalist, and that's important. Charles Alexander, who's a running back in the late '70s, was a Heisman Trophy finalist for a long time as LSU's leading running back. And Leonard Fournette. I mean, there was a lot of talk, when he was playing, as I'm sure Reed would attest, that is he going to win the Heisman? Is he going to do it in an era where it's gotten much harder for running backs to win the Heisman Trophy? But those are all tremendous players. I would include Jerry Stovall. Then going back to the 1930s, LSU's first great era. LSU was finished number 2 in the first AP poll in 1936, and their star player was Gaynell Tinsley, Gus Tinsley, who played end, and of course they played both ways back then too. And he's in the College Football Hall of Fame. So a lot of great choices. It's one of those things. There's no wrong answer really. When you say a lot of these names, but if you wanted a fourth, I guess I would go with Tommy Casanova, but Jerry Stovall is right up there as well.
Reed, you have another choice, or who you may have put on there, pre-Burrow and Daniels?
My first OLI outside looking in, I think, is going to be Kevin Faulk. Just because he when he chose LSU as the local guy, those kinds of guys weren't choosing LSU. And his decision to pick LSU was big because it showed that Louisiana high school players could come and they could play for LSU and they could excel at LSU. So I think his decision was really the domino before the domino, really what kick-started this modern era of LSU football. So in terms of just impact, I would have him right on the edge there. He's still the program's all-time leading rusher, so that's huge. And just because I'm leaning towards some of the local guys here. I like the guys who are from Louisiana. I think that helps put them over the edge. The other two I considered were Glenn Dorsey, because he was a huge part of the 07 national title team. Maybe, as Rab mentioned, LSU's greatest defensive player ever. And then the other guy I considered was Patrick Peterson, just because he's got a case to be LSU's best defensive back, best cornerback ever. And he like Tyrann Mathieu, was a huge part of the DBU sort of mystique that defined that pre-Burrow era of LSU football, the one with all the great defenses. So no real gripes if you put any of those guys or any of the guys Rab mentioned above mine. But obviously there's so many good choices. But those are the four for that last spot that I really gravitated towards.
Yeah, I think Rab, you put it well. There's no real wrong answers here. A Mount Rushmore for an LSU fan is kind of an emotional thing. We could probably sit here and say if you don't have Burrow and Cannon, you're wrong. But outside of that, there's not really any wrong answers. But
let me say one thing. A lot of the names we mentioned, like Joe Burrow's from Ohio and Jayden Daniels from California, and Billy Cannon was actually born in Mississippi. His dad came here because he needed a job during the war, and that's why they moved to Baton Rouge. But he was homegrown. A lot of these names we've mentioned are from Louisiana, and it is remarkable when you think about it. LSU's a national program, and they recruit all over and everything, but they always have to do well in Louisiana, and Louisiana continues to be, per capita, one of the top producers of talent in the NFL. And a lot of these names we mentioned, Faulk and Fournette and Mathieu and Cannon and Robinson and Casanova and Dorsey. A lot of these guys are from Gus Tinsley. A lot of these guys, Jerry Stovall. A lot of these guys are from Louisiana, and it's remarkable the size of this state, how well LSU has and its players have done, on the national stage and in professional football. I just wanted to throw that in.
Well, this has been a really fun discussion. I wanted to leave, and this could be a whole other podcast, but I'm going to open it up real quick. If you had to make a quick take Mount Rushmore for all LSU sports, not just confining it to football, who you putting on, Rab?
All right. Well, Pete Maravich is on there, right there, all-time leading scorer in college basketball history, men's college basketball history. Obviously, and what he did in 3 years was remarkable. Never been anybody like him. Billy Cannon, again, because he set the standard. I think you have to have LSU's had tremendous success over the years in women's athletics over the last 40 plus years. I think you have to have someone on a Mount Rushmore representing women's athletics. You can pick someone in track. You can even pick someone in gymnastics now. But I would go with Simone Augustus, who also is sets the standard in women's athletics. And then you got to have a coach too, because as we said, the influence that the coaches have, and not just a coach but administrator. I would go with Skip Bertman. LSU is still living in the era of Skip Bertman. I mean, he created a sport basically at LSU and showed everyone that that baseball doesn't have to be a financial drain. You can actually do well and make a buck or not lose any money at it. And to win 5 titles in a decade is just tremendous. And Jay Johnson's chasing him now, but Skip Bertman created something here, and then became athletic director and led the program in a very impressive manner. So I think for an administrator coach, you have to include someone, and that would be Skip. But boy, there's a vast number of people you could pick, obviously.
Man, it's super hard to do this, but I think those 4, like, you kind of checked all the boxes. Again, we could argue Cannon versus Burrow, but I think you have to have a football player. I think you have to have a female athlete, certainly at least one. And then you have to have a representative of LSU's baseball program, which has been its most successful program, and they've had great players, but who are you taking over Skip? We saw Skip yesterday, by the way. Rab and I were out to lunch with the group, and we saw Skip Bertman at Mike Anderson's, and the whole room just shut down when he walked in. Oh, God, it's Skip Bertman. He still carries that sort of gravitas. And then, the Pete Maravich, my gosh, again, you could argue Shaq or somebody, but the all-time leading scorer in the history of college basketball without the 3-point line is pretty hard to top. So Reed, any disagreements there? Anybody else you would like to heavily consider?
Man, this was actually a little easier than I thought it would be. I do feel bad. I do feel bad leaving Simone off because I really like that Rab had her on, but I had Billy Cannon for his influence with football. I had Skip obviously for his influence with baseball and then what he did with the athletic department. Pete Maravich, the way people still talk about Pete Maravich, 50 plus years after he played at LSU is a big deal to me. And I think he, just for what he accomplished in 3-4 years at LSU, nobody will ever top that again. And my last spot was Burrow. I just the season he had, and arguably the greatest, not just the greatest season in LSU history, but maybe even the greatest college football team of all time. I couldn't have a list without him on it. So, those 4, stood out to me. But again, it's tough because you've got a lot of worthy names on there. I feel bad I don't have a woman, but those are the 4 that made the first cut for me.
I also thought of Mondo Duplantis, and he only competed 1 year at LSU before turning pro. But there's not many people you can say. You're talking about Cannon or Maravich or Burrow or anybody. He's the greatest ever in his sport. He's right now the greatest ever in pole vaulting. And LSU hadn't produced too many greatest evers. No one produces too many greatest evers. And for what he's done as an Olympian and as a world class athlete, he might end up. We do this again 10 years from now, he might be on there. He might have to be on there.
Like, if you had to ask, if you polled the entire world population, who's the best known LSU athlete, Mondo might win just because his sport is followed around the world, more so than football or baseball or basketball. But I don't know. I think it's a good discussion. Reed, to your point, we could probably have a men's sports Mount Rushmore and a women's sports Mount Rushmore, no problem, and come up with some good names. So maybe that's an idea for another day, another time. But this was fun. Again, drop in the comments what you think. What's your LSU football Mount Rushmore? What's your LSU sports Mount Rushmore? And where do we get it wrong? Where do you guys see it? We'd love to hear from you. Until then, we'll be back. I believe Monday, might be Tuesday, to preview LSU fall camp. It's certainly not fall out there, but we will have fall camp. And football season is coming soon, so we'll be back next week. Until then, for Reed Dorsey and Scott Rabelais, I'm Zach Ewing. Thank you for watching the LSU Sports Insider.